just to have a look at this particular example of evil, terrible grammar, and just together decide what you think is quite so offensive about it. Good luck. Appalling, isn't it? Disgusting. I'll give you a couple of minutes. I can see you're all bursting with ideas there. You can, of course. It was a piece of written text. It was from a newspaper article that was written in response to one of Toby Young's pieces. And it's important because we will come back to the idea of grammar and genre as we go on. So, there it is. The worst piece of grammar written or spoken in Great Britain last year. And, you know, from a language teaching point of view, you might be looking at this thinking, do you know what, if any of my students produced this, I'd be over the moon. But no, it's terrible. And here are some of the reasons why Toby Young finds it so appalling. He doesn't like this thing, little account is taken of blah, 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 that young children need to relate abstract ideas to their experience. And what he doesn't like about this is the fact that has been elided from this particular sentence. When I read it, I didn't notice this at all, probably like you. I read over it because your brain fills in these elided gaps, which is why the language can be elided in the first place. And, you know, in newspaper articles and that kind of genre of written language, this elision of superfluous conjunctions is actually highly common. He doesn't like this mixture of singles and plurals, their experience, lives, and activity. It should either be singular or plural. You can't mix these things up. And he doesn't like this thing of much of it demands too much, too young. If you have any British people of a certain age in the audience, such as myself, who grew up in the early 1980s, there was a really big pop song by a group called The Specials called Too Much, Too Young. And Andy Cowell's doing the dance at the back. Look at that. There's a sight. Yes, the silent dance of an aging man recalling his youth. Look at that. What a lovely sight. Yeah, have you got the black and white socks? And the interesting thing about the song Too Much Too Young was it's you've done too much, too young. Okay? But according to Toby Young, presumably they mean something like demand too much when children are too young to be ready for so much. That is apparently good grammar. That's much clearer. That's a much better, more beautifully constructed sentence. But as worded, it simply is not English. I'm sure you all felt that when you looked at that initial example of bad grammar. You were probably looking at it going, what is this? It's not English. Because young is an adjective and cannot ever be an adverb. Because English is one of those really fixed languages where words can never change word class, and it just never happens at all. Despite the fact that young is also apparently used as a noun in Toby Young's surname, but presumably that fact escapes him. And apparently Chaucer, who some people seem to think was a halfway decent writer of the English language, was also a user of bad grammar. In this little extract from the Canterbury Tales, he that outlives this day and comes safe home, okay? Safe home, you know, safe is an adjective and can never be used as an adverb. Oh, except possibly in Chaucer because, you know, that was a long time ago and anyway, it's a classic. So, there's a strange thing that grammar does to people. And it kind of brings out a lot of people's frenzies and concerns. And I think as language teachers, the way we think about grammar and the way that we present grammar to our students has a huge impact on learning and on the way that students perceive language itself and the way that they perceive learning and what's necessary for them to engage with in terms of learning. As I said, when I first read this, my first thought was, you should be so lucky if that's the worst example of grammar that you've ever encountered. Around the time I first encountered Toby Young and his Bad Grammar Award, I was reading a novel by an American novelist called Jonathan Safran Foer. Don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. He's a Jewish New Yorker, and he wrote this wonderful first novel called Everything is Illuminated. And it's basically about a Jewish New York American guy whose family had roots in Ukraine and fled Ukraine. And it's about him going back to Ukraine to try to retrace his family roots. And a lot of the most kind of terrifying, horrific details of the story are rendered through the words of his Ukrainian translator, his obviously fictionalized Ukrainian translator. And throughout the book, you get these extracts of letters from his Ukrainian translator. And as I was thinking about Toby Young's Bad Grammar Award, I was reading this novel. And one of the things that really struck me about the letters that the fictionalized Ukrainian translator was sending to the fictionalized Jewish New York guy looking to retrace his roots was how similar they were to a lot of the pieces of writing that my proficiency students will sometimes deliver to me. I don't know how many of you teach proficiency, but if you do, you may well be aware of this phenomenon whereby students have got the exam, it's a January start, the exam's not until June, they cruise along quite happily thinking they're doing okay because they can watch Friends and understand most of it on TV. And about 4 weeks before the exam, there's you still saying, you're doing okay, but you need to practice your writing. And they say, yeah. 3 weeks before the exam, you're doing well, but you really need to practice your writing. About 10 days before the exam, they suddenly have this kind of panic freak out. And they say, please, Hugh, I've done some writing for you. At last, here it is. Can you correct it? And you look at it and you think, oh my God, what do I do with this piece of writing? And a lot of the time, the problem is it's articulately expressed English, but written in a very, very peculiar way. And you have to kind of go through it all and sort of try to break down the way that they think the language works and help them reconstruct it and help them see why the words they've tried to use don't work in that context, don't collocate in that way, don't grammar in that way. And I was thinking about this as I read this wonderful first extract, which I'll give you a minute to read. Okay? Obviously written for comic effect. But there's an interesting point about all of this connected to grammar. I'll give you a minute. It's those proficiency students who've got an online thesaurus. You know, teacher, look how articulate my language is. Yeah, about that. I have always thought of myself as very potent and generative. I bet you have, yeah. So, when I first read this, what was sort of interesting for me was it reminded me a lot of my sort of Russian students, Arabic-speaking students, who go mad with a thesaurus and want to present themselves as being very erudite and articulate and in possession of a whole wide range of sort of highfalutin synonyms. And part of the problem is that as you're kind of correcting this stuff, the temptation to simply cross the whole thing out, rewrite it, and then say, the problem with your writing was you don't use the word flaccid like this. You don't use the word dub like this. You don't use the word spleening like this. Here's how you use that word. Here's how you use this word. Then I sort of looked at it and thought, it's interesting because it's obviously a kind of comically ridiculous piece of English, as you can tell from the ripples of laughter around the room. But is it grammatically incorrect? I mean, basically, no. It's basically entirely grammatically correct, apart from possibly there's one past tense somewhere that you could change. Yeah, where is it? Somewhere. Yeah, you know, there's maybe one or two little tiny bits where you want to maybe change the tense. But what makes it wrong, what makes it peculiar, what makes it comic, is nothing to do with grammar. And I think this is also something that you start to notice as a language teacher, where a lot of the errors that students actually produce exist in this weird grey area where they're not obviously grammatical mistakes, but they're not obviously anything else, okay? Here are some examples that I've heard or seen written from students in the last couple of years. And I think what's interesting about all of them is, are they actually problems with big structural grammar, or are they problems deploying certain words grammatically correctly, or in a kind of patterned way? So when you've got something like, "Are you want to travel a lot?" is that a problem with the student never having studied the past simple and not knowing that want is a verb? Or is that a problem of knowing how to use want and how to grammar the word want? The same way, you know, he put down me for the problem. The temptation, I think, often as a teacher is to kind of correct the surface grammar and to say, no, it's a separable phrasal verb. He put me down for the problem. And then you think, wait a minute, you don't put people down for problems, you criticize people for problems. So what looks like a grammar problem is, in this case, in this instance, actually a kind of phrasal problem or a lexical problem. The old classic, she's been knowing him for a while. The temptation often, I think, for teachers is to kind of say, oh, we don't use stative verbs in the continuous tense. And then the students will say, what about McDonald's, I'm loving it? What about that song, I've been loving you too long? What about, I'm not feeling very well? What, you know, there's a whole list of exceptions. And then as a teacher, you have to kind of say, well, we don't use stative verbs in the continuous form except when we do, which is quite a lot of the time, but, you know, don't worry about that. Just trust me, I'm a teacher, okay? I mean, actually, I think here, it's a problem of knowing how to deploy the word no grammatically. And maybe the only true thing you can say about a sentence like this is, we don't generally use the word no in the present perfect continuous. Next one's interesting, because, you know, you think about things, yeah? You can think about a policy. You can't rethink about a policy. You just rethink the policy. Why? Because that's how that word works in English usually. Rethink grammars in a different way to the word think. The next one, again, it's another sort of classic. You know, is this a problem with knowing when to use their and when to use its? Or is it a problem with knowing when to use no point ing, which usually goes with theirs? You know, it's a kind of phrasal problem in a sense. The next one was a student describing a picture, and they said, oh, in this picture, they look for shelter because it's storming, okay? You know, because there's a storm, because it's stormy, because there's a storm going on. Why can't I make it into a verb? Well, sometimes you can make nouns into verbs, sometimes you can't. Ask Toby Young, he knows about these kinds of things, I'm not so sure. And I think what's interesting about all of this is there's a kind of very grey area between lexical errors and grammatical errors a lot of the time. And interestingly, a man who's often regarded as a kind of doyen of grammar knowledge and grammar teaching, Michael Swan, nails this whole kind of problem very, very acutely. This is what Michael Swan once said. Not that any coursebook writers ever listened. So Michael Swan himself is basically saying grammar is not one thing, grammar is many, many different things. And it's a stupid idea to try and talk about grammar and approach grammar as if it's always one thing that we can teach in the same way. And yet coursebook after coursebook after coursebook is full of present, practice, produce kind of exercises of grammar. the Raymond Murphy kind of vision of here's the explanation, here's the controlled practice kind of exercises, which has sort of come to dominate English language teaching, still prevails, even though people who have spent their whole lives thinking about grammar are sort of shouting from the sidelines saying, wait a minute, it's a bit more complicated than that. So what I want to move on to think about really is, if grammar's not one thing, but grammar is a range of different kinds of things, what kinds of different things might grammar be? Okay? And obviously, there's the kind of traditional way of thinking about what grammar might be, the more sort of dominant way in which we've come to think about grammar in English language teaching. So on one level, we can think about grammar as types of words and their functions, you know, young. Things like up. If you ask most people what's up, they'll tell you it's a preposition. Well, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It depends. They'll have to up their offer. It's clearly a verb. The whole area's on the up. It's a noun. I was up till 3. It's an adverb. You know, he's up in his room. It's part of a prepositional phrase. Up the Arsenal! Do we have any Chelsea supporters in the audience? Sorry, you missed a glorious weekend of football in London last weekend. And, you know, here it's sort of part of an imperative, yeah? So this is one way that we've sort of traditionally been encouraged to think about grammar and to maybe help students notice grammar and process grammar. There's also the beloved by people like Toby Young, who are trying to hold back the tides of change, rules and forms. Obviously, this includes tenses, you know, they're very clearly part of what grammar is. I think in English language teaching, we've come to see them as pretty much all that grammar is, but they're obviously part of what grammar is. On top of that, you've got all of these kind of rules, you know, the difference between few, a little, a few, a little. I'm sure you've all had fun with that exciting unit in course books over the years. Much, many, a lot of, you know, don't split infinitives, even though they do it on Star Trek. You know, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Wrong! Don't say less, say fewer. And if you see a supermarket using the word less when they should write fewer, write a furious letter to the Daily Telegraph, because that will stop it. So there's obviously, you know, this kind of way of thinking about grammar. There are also kind of slots that are very beloved, again, of course books and of grammars that students buy. One of the problems, I think, with the kind of slot approach to grammar is it operates on the assumption that all forms of all possible uses are somehow equal. This is an example that is actually from a real course book at the back, kind of supposedly demonstrating how the tenses work, okay? You might want to have a quick look at it and think about which ones of those do you think you've ever said? Which ones of those do you think are actual examples of how the language is really used? And this isn't to say that we don't ever use the past continuous passive, or that we don't use, you know, past perfect continuous. We obviously do. But I would suggest not like this. You know, even if you think, I drive cars. I mean, that in itself is a very weird thing to tell someone. What do you do for a living? I drive cars. Okay. Taxi driver? Just what? Chauffeur? What are you? You know, I'm driving cars. Good. How many at once? All at the same. 3 hands. I have driven cars. Good. That's very, very nice to know. You know, cars had been being driven. So, you know, again, with grammar, yes, you have these slots and yes, you have these structures that exist. Some examples are much more probable than others. Many, many things are possible. Actually, a very limited number of things are probable. And I think as language teachers, we need to be asking ourselves, is what we're teaching probable or just possible? Because when you're learning a foreign language, you know, your brain space is limited, the time that you have to study is limited. You want to be learning what's probable rather than what's possible. There's also obviously syntax and the position of words within sentences. Often, again, I think, very generically dependent. So things like this kind of fronting, you know, no account was taken of changes in the population of each village that might have occurred since 1873. Little account has been taken of passengers' needs and priorities. This kind of use of fronting is very, very specific to particular genres of written language. And literal things like, it's often the little words that are the most tricky to learn in a foreign language. Words like even. I was teaching last year and I had this sentence: I've had a really busy day, I haven't even had time for a coffee. And one of the students asked me, what does even mean? So yeah, it's an impossible question to answer in this kind of context. All you can do is to show other kinds of examples, like, I've been on my feet all day, I haven't even had time for a break. It doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, doesn't even swear. And all you can do is to sort of show it's often used like this in these kinds of contexts. So there's these kind of syntactical issues and these kind of positional issues that occur within sentences that I think generally most of us would agree are what we think of when we think of grammar. And of course, there's tenses and there's verb phrases, the kind of traditional ELT canon of, the present simple forms of the verb to be, units 1 and 2, elementary, pre-intermediate and intermediate, the present simple, the past simple forms of the verb to be. So again, this is often the way we kind of come to think about what students need to learn before they can be exposed to the next big block of grammar that we're going to drop on them from